Okay, we want to see me. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm really excited that you have decided to join me today. My name is Dr. Jennifer Levin, and I am a grief therapist in Pasadena, California. I am so honored that you've chosen to spend time with me today. I decided to develop this webinar to help individuals who are grieving the death of a loved one in the midst of this pandemic. So I want to start off with a little bit of self-disclosure. This is my very first webinar, and I'm still learning some of the technology. I have muted everyone during the presentation, and my goal is to have time for questions at the end. During the webinar, if you do have any questions or concerns, go ahead and type them into the Q&A folder, and my co-host Susanna will either immediately respond or save your questions for me till the very end. Our time together today is slated to last about 45 minutes, but I'm happy to stay longer with questions. Finally, I do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and later this evening, everybody will receive an email with a link to the recording today. So at this point, I'm going to actually turn off my camera, bring the slides back to the front, and I will see you at the end for our Q&A. Okay, here we go. I want to start off by joining us together in the purpose of our webinar today. As you know, many people in the world right now are fearful and stressed about contracting the virus or infecting loved ones. Worlds have been turned upside down, and for most of us, any sense of normality is gone. Simple things like going to the market, spending time with family and friends, and daily routines have disappeared overnight. To make matters worse, we don't know when things will return to normal or what the world is going to look like when this is all over. For those of you who are living with grief or the death of a loved one, your world has already turned upside down. In fact, you may be experiencing a double whammy, trying to cope with your grief on top of trying to survive the threat of the coronavirus. My goal for our time together today is to increase the support that you have and to provide you with new tools for living with your grief and the threat of COVID-19. You may be asking yourself, am I in the right place right now? Or is this webinar for me? The answer is yes. It's a universal fact that the entire world is impacted by COVID-19. Social distancing and shelter in place are now universal norms that guide our behaviors. Almost everyone is grieving the changes in the world and concerned about those they love. Despite the universal grief related to COVID-19, I wanted to create a special forum for individuals like you coping with the death of a loved one or caring for someone with a life-threatening illness. Right now, your experiences, concerns, and feelings are unique. Your needs are different, and therefore your coping skills and tools must be different. Finally, I want to share this information with those of you who want to help others during this time. This includes professional caregivers, mental health professionals, and anyone else who wants to help others who are grieving and living with the fear of the coronavirus. So before we jump into our main content, I invite you to take a minute to prepare yourself and your space for the work we're going to do. Find a way to minimize your distractions, silence your electronics, and clear your physical and mental space. This may involve taking some grounding breaths, silencing your computers and phones, shutting your door, or even moving the piles in front of you to create openness and a sense of calm. A little bit more about me and why I'm qualified to lead this webinar. I am a licensed marriage family therapist in California, and I specialize in traumatic grief, serious illness, and post-traumatic growth. I have a doctorate in public health from UCLA, and I'm also a recognized fellow in thanatology, the study of death, dying, and bereavement. I have over 25 years experience working in the field of grief and end-of-life care. I work in conjunction with my assistant, Winnie, my therapy dog, who comes to work every day with me and provides hugs and love to everyone she meets. Working with individuals living with grief has taught me so much about the fragility and uncertainty of life. In return, I have learned how to live in the now, how to identify and honor my priorities, and I know how to decrease things I take for granted. I know that life can change on a dime. I know that one day your world can seem stable or even perfect, and in an instant, everything can change. I also know that human beings are resilient and that we are capable of meeting our toughest challenges. Today, I'm going to use my knowledge, experiences, and what I've learned from my clients to help you get through this difficult time. With that said, my mission is to help you cultivate a new understanding of your unique situation, validate your experiences, and provide you with the tools and skills you will need to cope with your grief during COVID-19. To achieve this mission, we are going to focus on 5 content areas. First, the parallels between grief and fears of COVID-19. Second, surviving empathy overload. Third, staying connected to your grief. Fourth, remaining grounded during times of panic. And finally, how to avoid feeling like a victim and to focus on ways that you can grow. We're going to review each of these content areas and focus on some tools you can use to cope within each area. My goal is that after this webinar, you will have a better understanding of your grief experience within the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and you will have increased confidence in your ability to cope with your grief and COVID fears. You will also gain new tools to remain connected to your grief, reduce your anxiety, and be able to focus your mental energy on those you love. At the end of the webinar today, I will provide you with some free resources and additional support in the areas of general wellness, COVID-19, general grief, and meditation. Finally, there will be an opportunity to participate in a support community and deepen your learning from today. So let's start with the parallels between grief and living with fears of COVID-19. I do want to mention that your ability to relate to some of these parallels may be associated with the amount of time you have been grieving. If you take a minute to think about your grief experiences, you can probably relate to many of the grief symptoms listed here. Despite the uniqueness of our grief journeys, we do have many commonalities. Most everyone can relate to feelings of sadness, emotional pain, physical discomfort, fears of the unknown, and the waves of emotions that transpire throughout your grieving process. While grieving, you have probably also experienced an increase in feeling vulnerable and concerned about the well-being of your loved ones. However, if you step back and reflect, you can see that these feelings may be very similar to your COVID-19 fears. You may also now be scared, sad, and fearful of the unknown. You may be experiencing physical pain or worries about your health and the health of your loved one. And just in grief, we have no idea when this will end or what our world is going to look like afterwards. One of the hardest parts of grief is living in the unknown. Often we ask ourselves, how long is this grief going to last? Am I going to be okay? How am I going to survive without my loved one? At this moment in time, not only do you have to deal with the uncertainty related to your grief, but you also have to cope with the uncertainty related to COVID-19. Humans have always been scared of the unknown because the only way we can know the future is to have lived it. We like to be in control of our circumstances, and when we feel out of control, we may not know how to act, and we often doubt ourselves. We fear future consequences, and we are highly likely to catastrophize what might happen or jump to the worst conclusions. As a result, many of us are left feeling depressed and anxious and in our grief, and now we have these same fears related to the virus. The good news is there are ways to cope with the unknown, and it starts by acknowledging what you do know. I encourage each of you to make a list of your fears and make a list of your feelings. Identify what you do know in a way that is factual and without judgment. Examples of this may sound like, right now I am scared and I'm lonely. Or some days my grief is harder than others. Perhaps you might be able to acknowledge, I have food and provisions to meet my needs, and my family is staying safe by following recommended precautions. Only when you can identify your feelings and your fears can you start to focus your energy on what you have the power to change and to accept or learn to tolerate the things you can't. Okay, I know this one might seem a bit off, but if you think about it, your grief has prepared you to cope with the threat of the virus. Let's break this down. First, you know that grief can be such an isolating experience, and that you may feel that others do not understand your pain. You know what it feels like to be alone and to feel lonely. When it comes to the virus, however, you are not alone. You're surrounded by family, friends, and even strangers who can relate to what you're experiencing. Some of you may find that you're not as concerned or worried about the virus as others. As you know, grief changes your perspective and how you look at the world. After you have experienced a significant loss, you may not fear this threat because you have already experienced what may be the worst pain or experience in your life. Third, you know how to live in uncertainty, and you also may have already developed tools for living in uncertainty during your grief that you can use now at this time. And finally, you know through your grief that every day is different. Some days are harder than others, but even the toughest days get a little better. No matter how difficult things may seem right now, you know you will not always feel this way, and some of the toughest feelings will pass. Next, let's transition to empathy overload. As a therapist, I am so grateful I have the opportunity to work with compassionate people who care deeply about the world we live in and the health and well-being of others. Caring for others is an amazing quality, but in times like this, it can be a huge downfall. There may be many of you paralyzed by the suffering, pain, and death happening in our community and in our world, and I call this empathy overload. What is empathy? It's the capacity to understand or feel what other people are experiencing from their frame of reference. It's the capacity to place oneself in another person's position. Your grief has given you the capacity to connect deeply with others and feel what they feel. You can relate to families caring for someone sick, or total strangers who have recently experienced the death of a loved one. When there is so much pain and loss in the world, your compassion and empathy can go into overdrive. Signs of empathy overload may include highly empathic and susceptible to the pain of others, exaggerated concerns or worries for others that you care about, feelings of being untethered, overwhelmed, or the lack of bandwidth to take on anything new, feelings of hopelessness and despair, or the inability to care for yourself and the immediate ones that you love. When you are unable to disconnect from constant pain and the suffering of others, empathy overload can interfere with your daily functioning. So how do we cope with empathy overload? The first step is being able to recognize that you have a limit in your capacity to care. Second, when you're feeling depleted, I recommend you focus on caring for yourself and those closest that you love. I encourage you to develop an imaginary bubble or protective shield around the people you love the most. Once inside, you can channel your energy, love, and empathy to those within your bubble. It may help you to know that others you worry about are being cared for inside someone else's bubble. Other steps to coping with empathy overload include reducing your exposure to the news and the media, increasing your self-care, and focusing on things in the world that are good or going right now. Let's move on to staying connected to your grief when the rest of the world seems like it's on hold. I'm sure you've noticed that everyone is responding to this crisis in a different way. Some people are calm and have transitioned into our new normal with little difficulty. Others are experiencing extreme amounts of stress and anxiety and having trouble maintaining a daily routine. How you react to the virus may be impacting your ability to stay connected to your grief. Every day, my clients share how their fears of COVID-19 are impacting their grief. For some, the virus is a welcome distraction from pain and sadness. There are a lot of logistics involved in staying safe, and the planning and safety precautions you should be taking right now may seem like a full-time job. As a result, your grief may not be the most important thing on your mind. Being distracted is not necessarily a bad thing, and it might be exactly what you need right now. For others, especially those who have experienced a more recent loss or those in the midst of caregiving, the fears of the virus may be taking away from the grief experience. Unfortunately, COVID-19 has postponed grieving rituals, including family gatherings, funerals, and celebrations of life. It also highlights the absence of our loved ones at a time when we want and need them the most. For those of you caring for loved ones who are sick, the risk of the virus can also increase the difficulty of caregiving. Unfortunately, all of this may contribute to delayed or complicated grief in the future. Those of you feeling disconnected from your grief can use some of these tools to remain engaged with your loved one no longer present. First, a good way to check in or monitor the intensity of your grief is to use what I call a grief thermometer. Ask yourself on a daily basis to rate your grief on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being low or no grief, and 10 being the highest. You can use this tool to monitor patterns of intensity or as a way to know it's time to enact a plan. Second, it can be helpful to designate a specific time each day or each week to feel your grief feelings. You can do this by journaling, looking through pictures, listening to music, writing letters, or talking with family and friends about the loved one no longer present in your life. Third, it can be very helpful to have a specific place in your home or outside to connect to your grief. Some people like to sit in the yard or be in nature, go to a favorite chair, or even go to the cemetery to be present in the feelings associated with their loss. Finally, there are several online memorial sites and online grief forums you can turn to stay connected to your grief during this time. Okay, I want you to know there are ways to remain grounded even when it feels like the rest of the world is panicking. At the onset of this virus in the United States, empty shelves at the stores, lack of toilet paper and cleaning supplies, and the fury of misinformation caused a lot of us to panic. Unfortunately, panic can be contagious. Panic is a form of fear which can produce irrational behavior, and this behavior can spread quickly to others. When we act out of fear, we are not thinking rational, and we often jump into survival mode. It's easy to get caught up in the fears of others and react with our emotions and not our rational thoughts. Unfortunately, this can cause increased anxiety and poor decision-making for all involved. Currently, there are a lot of techniques available to manage panic and anxiety. Some of my favorite include exercise, meditation, deep breathing, and guided imagery. I also can't say enough about the power of a solid routine, daily structure, and planning events in your life so that you have something to look forward to on a daily or a weekly basis. For those of you interested, I encourage you to learn more about cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, including reframing and thought stopping, to help control some of those runaway thoughts related to panic and anxiety. So the final topic I want to cover today relates to empowerment and growth. Given your losses and grief, it would be easy to feel like a victim of circumstances. Instead, I'm going to encourage you to focus on ways to grow from what you're going through right now. It's important to remember that grief and loss are universal events, even when it feels so personal. In order to cope with what's happening in your world, I encourage you to take ownership and responsibility for what you need and what you want. This is the perfect time to learn how to set boundaries with family and friends and learn how to say no when things are not in your best interests. Finally, I encourage you to practice and engage in self-compassion, kindness, and forgiveness. There are many things happening right now that are beyond your control. Remember, you are doing the best you can given the circumstances and the resources that are available to you. People often ask how I'm able to work in a field with constant pain and loss. The answer? I am privileged to witness post-traumatic growth. This term was coined by two researchers in North Carolina who recognized that some individuals not only heal from a traumatic event, but grow in a way that leaves them more evolved and stronger than before the trauma occurred. They have identified 4 areas in which growth occurs. Unfortunately, going into depth here is beyond the scope of this webinar, but I wanted to mention that it is possible to grow stronger from our losses. Post-traumatic growth usually occurs when we are able to sense, new opportunities available to us in our life that weren't there before a trauma occurred. It also occurs when we deepen our relationship with ourselves, with our friends, and with others as a result of the trauma. It relates to increased personal strength, knowing that you are stronger because you survived a loss that was extremely difficult and you came out on the other side. And finally, it involves having a greater appreciation for life because you know how quickly things can change and disappear. So as we begin to wind down, the next 2 slides highlight some of the main points I want you to leave with today. Number 1, you've been here before. You've lived with uncertainty, with the unknown, with difficult feelings, and you're getting through it. Number 2, focus on the actions you can take and not the things that you cannot control. Number 3, when you worry about everyone, it doesn't help you. Instead, place those you love the most in a protective bubble and focus your time and energy on caring for them and yourselves. Finally, schedule time and activities to stay connected to your grief. Other takeaways? Remember, do not react to the panic or fears of others. Use routine, consistency, and pleasant event scheduling to help you stay grounded and calm. Remember, despite everything that's going on, there is good in the world and you are resilient. And finally, there are opportunities to grow in every trauma. So there are lots of wonderful free resources available, and I want to highlight a few of them so that you can take advantage and get the support you needed. Later this evening, you will receive a follow-up email, which will have all of the links to these resources and their corresponding URLs. I want to highlight a few. In terms of general support, currently, Yale is offering the Happiness course. This started off as a course for students and became the most popular class that the university offered. In the last 2 weeks, over 300,000 people have signed up for this free course online, and I encourage you to do the same. There's also a site called What's Up, which provides mental health guidance, which includes coping mechanisms and strategies for reframing some of the negative thoughts that I talked about earlier. And finally, I really want to bring your attention to the COVID Emotional Wellness Support and Helpline. This started off in Ventura, but has expanded services to all of California, so you can call and talk with somebody and find out about more of the resources in your area. In terms of online grief support, there's some wonderful sites out there. My favorite is What's Your Grief? They focus on general grief and they have a wonderful newsletter. Obviously, a lot of their articles lately have been talking about dealing or living with fears of COVID-19. The Dougie Center is fantastic for kids. There's a wonderful site for widows calling Soaring Spirits, and they also have an online forum called Widows Village, which breaks it down by how an individual has died and how long since a death has occurred. In terms of support after suicide, I encourage you to check out Alliance of Hope. And if you're feeling suicidal or the need to talk to anyone during this time, please also contact the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Finally, a couple of great sites for meditation. UCLA has a wonderful mindfulness center. There's a site called Inside Timer, and then 2 applications called Calm and Headspace that are very helpful during this time. Before we move on to questions and answers, I'd like to share some additional support available to you after this webinar. Around 8 tonight, you will receive the follow-up email that includes the link to the replay, a copy of the resources listed today, and again, the corresponding URLs. For those of you who might be interested in more support, I have started, or I'm going to start, a support community that will last for 6 weeks in telehealth support groups. And this group will further explore the 5 topics we've addressed today and dive deeper into the tools and coping mechanisms that I presented. Currently, the groups are set up at different days, and I'm happy to add more if there's interest. More information will be included in the email later this evening. So this is going to mark the end of my formal comments, and now I'm going to stop the webinar slides and turn the video back on. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have, or you're welcome to touch base after the presentation and email me directly. For those of you who choose to exit at this time, I want to thank you so much for participating in your grief and wellness journey. So, okay, I have a couple questions here. Right here under the Q&A folder. First, what are some of the best self-care techniques that you can recommend? This is a great question. It has to do, obviously it differs for everybody. Self-care has a lot of different components to it. It can be spending time with friends and family, time in nature, being creative, but it also includes taking care of ourselves and doing things like going to bed on time, going to the doctor when you're sick, getting regular medical checkups, setting boundaries, communicating your feelings to loved ones. And so I kind of encourage you to look at what some of your needs are right now, or some of the things that you feel like you're struggling, and make a list of what might be helpful for you in that self-care. Next question. You mentioned complicated and delayed grief. Can you say more about that? I sure can. So delayed grief is just like what it sounds. It is when we postpone our grief and it resurfaces at a later time. Many times we are forced to postpone our grief. I've worked with many parents who say, I need to take care of the needs of my kids first, and I'll get to my grief later. And that's a conscious choice, and they realize that later on they need to address that grief. Complicated grief is something that's still being defined, but basically the current thoughts is it's grief that lasts longer than 6 months, and it includes intense sorrow, pain, and rumination related to the loss of your loved one. Let me see if I can just do this. Hold on a second. Trying to see if I can make myself larger. Okay, I did. All right, another question. What is the difference between depression and grief? Great question. There's a lot of similarities between depression and grief, but the differences are very important. First, remember, grief is not pathological. It's universal. It happens to all of us, and it's actually the price we pay for loving someone. Depression, on the other hand, can be considered a mental illness. It responds very well to therapy, and it can also respond well to medication for some. Depression has a tendency to last longer than grief if it's untreated. One other thing related to the differences between grief and depression is that when you're experiencing grief, you are able to remember positive things, and self-esteem is not impacted. Okay, the next question. What is the best way to help a family member who is not using healthy coping mechanism and their grief is activated there during this time? Wow, that's a great one. There are many times that we turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms when we're grieving. This can include alcohol, eating, shopping, denial and isolation, anything that an individual may do that may be actually helpful and early on and in the beginning, but later on be harmful. If this is a time that somebody's turning to an unhealthy coping mechanism because of their grief and COVID-19, it's definitely something to be expected. When we're under stress, our unhealthy coping mechanisms seem to increase, even things that we might have controlled early on. So just acknowledging to that person that you're concerned about the negative impact their behavior might be having on them, and see if you can help them come up with some other coping mechanisms that are healthy and might address the problem. And feel free on this one to send me an email, and I'm happy to correspond with you about more specifics of the situation. Okay, the next one. Can you say something about denial? I think I get overloaded on empathy and then go into denial. Denial can be a beautiful thing. There is, or I should say, there are a lot of realities right now that are extremely difficult. And at times, I think we all vacillate in and out of denial. The word I like, or the thing that I like to do, is to help people into distraction versus denial. So to say, yes, this is a reality, but it's more than I can handle right now. So what I'm going to do is to choose to focus on something that will distract me from my pain or distract me from what I'm experiencing, and not focus on ignoring the fact about, or the facts related to what is going on. Next question. I am a formal caregiver of a father who died of Alzheimer's. In the last 2 weeks, I have reoccurring feelings of relief that I'm not caring for my dad and trying to care for my feelings of physical vulnerabilities regarding this moment. Regarding this virus. At moments I feel guilty, but not sure how to process. I want to start off, thank you for saying this, and to normalize this. I've had several clients who, number one, have acknowledged, I'm so glad my loved one is not experiencing what's happening in the world right now. Being glad that their loved one is not at risk, and feeling a lot of relief related to the fact that they no longer have to go into caregiving mode during this time. The guilt that you may be experiencing is very common and is often associated with a normal grieving experience. So tools here being compassionate to yourself, normalizing the fact that your reactions and your emotions are completely normal given this abnormal situation. Again, feel free to reach out, and I'm more than happy to have a conversation and help you process those feelings. Next, I am living alone and have feelings of isolation and loneliness. I feel envious of my friends and family who have partners. It highlights my loss. How can I cope better? Yes, again, thank you so much for bringing this up. Isolation and loneliness is something we often cope with when we're grieving. And now to be forced into isolation as a result is even harder. It's very common to feel envious of friends who have partners or families who are able to be together. Very, very common reaction. Yes, this is absolutely going to highlight your loss. There are a lot of wonderful ways to stay connected online, not our favorite. I currently work with all my clients online, and while I appreciate or I prefer to see people in person, it's still possible to remain connected. You may want to set up a Zoom call with your friends. I've seen things like virtual happy hours online, pajama parties. There's actually trivia things that you can do online, games that you can play with others online. It's a very, very different new world with all of this technology, but definitely stop. Excuse me, I got a note there that distracted me, but definitely acknowledge the loneliness that you're feeling and see if you can find somebody to share and to talk about that with. Okay. Next question. What is some advice you have for those that are at home with family members that don't necessarily get along? Wow, I have some clients in this situation and it's difficult to help them navigate. On top of that, the family just lost an important family member. That is definitely a tough situation as well. Everybody grieves differently, and very often our grief does not get along with other people's grief. Similarly, we all are responding to this threat differently. Tensions are high. I have many couples where one person is very concerned about the virus and very upset about how their partner is handling it or not handling it, and it's causing a lot of friction. Acknowledge that this is a very, very unusual circumstance. Everyone is together in a very small space. Tensions are running high. It's difficult. See if you can give yourself a little bit of leeway or compassion. For the family who's also dealing with the loss of the loved one, see what they can come together with. See if they can come together for a half hour to tell stories about the important family members. See if they can come together to reminisce, to look at pictures, to play a game, to focus on activities that will join rather than separate. But again, you have to acknowledge that everybody is responding to their grief differently and to fears of the virus differently. Okay, last question for today. Can I talk more about the bubble of protection? Yes, I sure can. This is a tool that I recommend. It may not be for everyone. It's a visual tool, and it involves placing those that you love in an invisible bubble or shield or force around them so that you can imagine them feeling safe. You can imagine them feeling cared for. You can imagine them being okay. We can't put everybody in our bubble because we don't have that capacity to care for others. But so many people I've talked with are worrying about the person on the street or the person at the market or the person, the neighbor who's home alone. And part of this bubble of protection is to imagine that they're also in the bubbles of protection of others. So instead of imagining them alone and uncared for, either put them in your bubble or know that they're being cared for somebody else, by somebody else, and in their bubble. I want to thank everyone today. These were great questions. Thank you so much for your participation. Again, look out for that email tonight. My email is around, and feel free to reach out at any time. I wish you all calmness. I wish you all safety, and I wish you all love during this difficult time. Take care of yourself. And again, thank you so much for joining. Okay.